This is downtown Dover, New Hampshire, once known to the Pennacook Abenaki as Cocheco. Richard Waldron is a well-known name in the city of Dover. Waldron Court is a street name for him. The Waldron Towers is a residential senior housing complex. The Waldron Cemetery holds several generations of Waldrons, including Major Richard Waldron. And one of the downtown Dover bridges over the Cocheco River displays an historical marker with a map labeling the various locations affected by the 1689 so-called Cochico Massacre, during which Richard Waldron was executed by the Pennacooks. In the late 1600s, Cocheco was the place where the Pennacook Abenaki homeland, in Dakina, met the fringes of the English settlers' New Hampshire colonial frontier. On the banks of the Cocheco River, the English settlement was known as the Cocheco Plantation. This is where Richard Waldron built a fortified garrison house for his family and operated several business enterprises, including a trading post that catered to the needs of the Indians. A small settlement in the 1670s, there were only 4 other garrison houses in Cocheco at this time. Waldron was executed in his home at Cocheco in June of 1689, an event that English and later early American colonial historians called the Cocheco Massacre. For 3 centuries, this event has continued to be portrayed by the dominant Eurocentric society as an unprovoked massacre that was perpetrated on the defenseless English colonists by so-called savages, the Pennacook Abenaki warriors. However, the wider community's perception of New Hampshire's indigenous peoples is changing, and there's currently a new openness to hearing a more balanced history of these events. Even as the 400th anniversary of the colonial founding of Dover is celebrated, a newer notion, a decolonized perspective of history, has begun to come to the fore. And this 17th century event is coming to be seen as an understandable act of retribution by a group of formerly peaceful Pennacook people in retaliation for a great harm done to the Pennacooks and their allies by Major Richard Waldron 13 years earlier. Reports of this event, found in letters written by Waldron himself as well as 2 other English colonists, were sent to the Massachusetts colonial government. They have become available to contemporary historians and reveal a much more clear version of this story. These documents were not available to historians in the 17th, 18th, 19th, or most of the 20th centuries. However, noted historian Mary Beth Norton found these letters during her research at the Maine Historical Society archives. They are now digitized and discoverable through online records. These much more recently discovered primary source documents confirm the tribal memory, a deeper memory that the Pennacook Abenaki have of the so-called Cocheco Massacre. These documents also confirm why the Pennacooks felt justified in attacking Cocheco Plantation during King William's War. On this spot 13 years earlier, in September of 1676 during King Philip's War, 400 indigenous people, Pennacooks and their allies who were under Pennacook protection, had been falsely led by Richard Waldron to believe that they'd been invited to come to Cocheco to continue treaty discussions related to the Treaty of Cocheco that they had just signed with Waldron only 2 months earlier. Instead, the Pennacook group was tricked by Waldron. At his command, they were surrounded and captured by 4 units of the colonial militia. 10 young warriors were kept to act as scouts and soldiers for the English colonists, along with their immediate family members who were held at Cocheco to ensure their cooperation. The rest, 350 people, were round up and put on a ship at Piscataqua and sent to Boston as captives. As a result, 100 Native men, 250 Native women and children were surrounded and marched away. That was the last time their families ever saw most of them, and the last time most of those 350 people ever saw in Dakana, their homeland, where about 575 generations of their families had lived for over 12,000 years. Their descendants are still searching for them today. Looking to the reasons why these events happened at Cocheco, the paper trail leads directly to the actions of Richard Waldron. At the Cocheco settlement, Richard Waldron, who had acquired great tracts of land that made him a prominent landholder amongst the English, also regularly did business with the Pennacooks at his trading post, even though Waldron was known for his practice of cheating his Native American trading partners. When the Pennacooks objected to Waldron putting his hand on the scales as a counterweight and to weigh the scales in his favor during trading, he told the Pennacooks that his fist weighed exactly a pound, so they were not being taken advantage of. Even though they were well aware that Waldron was blatantly stealing from them, the Indians nevertheless continued to trade at his post because it was the closest trading post to their homes. The practical choice to deal with Waldron was made not only because Waldron stocked a useful supply of trade goods, but also because the Pennacooks were very wary of Waldron and most of the other English settlers, and needed to keep an eye on them in order to know what the English were doing. Trust was hard to come by. When King Philip's War broke out in 1675, the English leaders in Boston accused the northern Wabanaki tribes in Maine of allying with the Wampanoag tribe against the English. The English colonial government was also worried that the peaceful Pennacooks might ally with the other tribes and become a very real threat to the English colonists in New Hampshire. They sought assurances from the Pennacooks that they would remain peaceful and not become embroiled in the warfare that was raging just to the south of them in Massachusetts. In June of 1676, the Pennacooks were invited to Cocheco to engage in negotiations to assure that the Pennacooks would remain neutral in King Philip's War and sign a non-aggression treaty with the English. The Pennacooks remained in Cocheco for about a month while these negotiations were in progress. Because Waldron was closely involved with the government of Massachusetts, he was one of the primary negotiators on behalf of the English at the treaty conference held with the Pennacooks in July of 1676. 3 New Hampshire English colonists, Richard Waldron, Nicholas Shapley, and Thomas Daniel, formed a committee to represent the English colonists who lived in or near Cocheco, and met with the Pennacooks at Waldron's Cocheco garrison to negotiate the terms of a peace treaty. The Treaty of Cocheco was signed on July 3, 1676. Only 2 months later, suspecting that there were refugee warriors and their families from King Philip's War being harbored by Wanalancet and the Pennacooks, Richard Waldron received orders from the Massachusetts General Court telling him to assist in the capture of the refugees from among the Pennacooks. Accordingly, Waldron invited the Pennacooks to come back once again to Cocheco. On September 6, 1676, Waldron exhibited apparent hospitality by first offering the Pennacooks a meal, leading them to believe that Waldron was following the accepted way of receiving guests. Given that Waldron had negotiated peace terms with the Pennacooks only 2 months earlier, they likely would have viewed this invitation and hospitality as a continuation of the peace negotiations. After the meal was concluded, Waldron urged the Penacook men to play war games, which Waldron referred to as a sham battle, with the 2 militia, who apparently just happened to be there. Primary source documents, however, correct this notion. Letters exchanged between Waldron and the Massachusetts General Court in Boston show that the companies of English colonial militia were sent to Cocheco to capture the Pennacook Abenaki and the refugees under their protection, Narragansett, Nashua, and Groton Indians, who had fled north to remove their families from the war zone. The Pennacooks were allowed to fire the first volley. However, as soon as they discharged their muskets into the air, The Pennacooks were immediately surrounded and captured by the two militia companies on one side and the companies of Major Waldron and Captain Frost of Kittery on the other side. Historians from the 17th through the 20th centuries presented the English perspective of this event and tell us that 400 Pennacooks were captured, and that after separating the friendly Pennacook Abenaki from the group, only the refugee warriors from King Philip's War, about 200 in all, were arrested and taken to Boston. However, Richard Waldron himself contradicts that notion. In his written report to the Massachusetts General Court, dated September 6, 1676, Waldron stated,
"This day I drew up the Indians at Cocheco upon the open ground before my house, under the notion of taking them out into the service. Such of them as I saw meet, upon assembled, I made them eat and drink, and then surrounded them with the army, and calling the chief sagamores into the center, I told them what must be done, only that the innocent should not be damnified. They surrendered their arms, 20 in number. We have taken 80 fighting men, and 20 old men, and 250 women and children, 350 in all. We find among them, as I have information, Narragansett Indians, Groton and Nashaway Indians."
when the captives reached Boston, 8 men, who were believed to have killed English people, were executed. Despite release requests, only Ronald Lancet and about 50 of his Pennacook tribe, warriors and their families, were released after a few months of being imprisoned in Boston. The rest of the prisoners, about 300 of the remaining Pennacooks and their allies from other tribes, were sold into slavery. Many were shipped to such far-flung places as the Caribbean, Spain, Portugal, and Morocco, while others were sold to English colonial families. Those who were sold into slavery left their remaining family members, many of whom had not been present at Cocheco, experiencing grief for the loss of their kin and harboring anger against the English, especially Richard Waldron, for his trickery and what they also perceived as the deceit he used in capturing the Pennacook Abenaki at Cocheco. However, 13 years later, King William's War created the circumstances that gave rise to the Pennacook Attack on the Cochico settlement. This happened on June 27th and 28th, 1689, the event that has come to be known as the Cochico Massacre. The English colonial Eurocentric historical accounts tell us all the gruesome details of the event and frame it as a completely unprovoked attack. As it is recalled by the public today, accounts of the Cochico Massacre usually fail to frame the story as happening during wartime, when acts of violence from the English as well as the indigenous people were the norm. After all, violence is the very nature of warfare. The night before the raid, 5 Pennacook Abenaki women, who were very well known to the English colonists at Cocheco, divided up and went with a coordinated strategy to each of the garrison houses to ask to stay the night. In itself, these women asking for overnight hospitality was not an unusual occurrence. But on this night, June 27, 1689, all of the palisade fencing and fortified walls of the Cocheco garrisons could not protect the English colonists from a surprise attack by the Pennacook Abenaki warriors. They were led by Kangamangas, an angry young man who was now the sagamore of the remaining Pennacooks. They were a new generation of Pennacooks who were fed up with the English encroachment into Pennacook territory. Kangamangas was ready to exact retribution for Waldron's duplicity in the events surrounding the sham battle and the capture of so many of his relatives and friends who had been sold into slavery 13 years earlier. According to the plan that had been made, the 5 Pennacook Abenaki women who had sought overnight shelter in each of the garrisons waited until everyone was asleep, and then unbarred the unguarded palisade gates from the inside to allow their men to attack. Once the Pennacooks captured their main target, Richard Waldron, they tortured and killed him in a way that reveals pent-up anger and the need for retribution. As Waldron sat tied to a chair, having already had his skull bashed in, the Pennacooks asked him, "Who shall judge the Indians now?" Then each of the Pennacook warriors sliced a cut across Waldron's chest, saying, "I cross out my account." And then they finished torturing and killing him, and burned his house to the ground. 22 other Cochico colonists also died that night, and 29 more were taken captive. Some of the captives were retrieved almost immediately by colonists who followed the raiding party up toward Lake Winnipesaukee, and the others were taken to Canada and sold to the French. Some were later redeemed to be able to return home. An intriguing aspect to these war stories is how personal relationships between individual English people and individual Indigenous people, for good or bad, impacted the events of the Anglo-Abenaki Wars. Personal stories writ large. An example of this is the story of Elizabeth Hurd Hull. In the dark, early morning hours, while the night-long raid on Cochico was still underway, Elizabeth and her adult children were returning home from Portsmouth to Cochico. When they realized that the Cochico Plantation was under attack, Elizabeth hid in the woods as her adult children tried to make their way to their garrison to find out what was happening. Elizabeth knew she couldn't keep up with them, so she took cover. As she was hiding, an Indian discovered her and pointed his weapon at her, but he spared her life and suddenly ran away. Elizabeth recognized him as the young boy she had sheltered from Waldron's deceit 13 years earlier, when 350 Pennacooks had been captured and sold into slavery. Her kindness to him in the past had saved her life. For over 330 years, these events have been interpreted by English colonists and their descendants as proof of the brutality and savagery of New Hampshire's Pennacook Abenaki peoples. The story of the Kochico Massacre has been told and retold, but without the context of having happened in wartime. However, from the Pennacook's perspective, the manner in which Waldron was dealt his death was the venting of a very long-held anger. It was clearly a balancing of accounts larger than those accounts of the financial transactions that were kept in Waldron's trading post records. This is not a pretty story, but it is a true story that reveals the Pennacook Abenaki in wartime as people, not any more savage or less savage than the English colonists of 1689. However, it also reveals the Pennacooks as human beings with feelings and with families that they loved and grieved over, as surely as the English colonists felt for their own loved ones.